Imagine living a life deeply connected to the rhythm of the forest, maybe. Or picture carrying a label of suspicion, just because of who your family is. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating, complex, and, often challenging world of India's tribal communities. We'll be focusing on two very distinct groups: the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, PVTGs we call them, and the Denotified Tribes.
Exactly. And our goal for this deep dive really is to understand the historical reasons behind their current struggles. We want to explore what makes their experiences so unique and also see what efforts are underway and, frankly, what's still needed to support them. We're kind of pulling back the curtain on the layers of history, policy, and, the human stories that have profoundly shaped their lives.
Right. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to grasping a really vital part of India's incredibly diverse social fabric. We want to get beyond the headlines, get to the human experiences, and maybe some surprising facts along the way, all in a conversation designed to help you connect the dots. Okay, so let's start with the PVTGs. We often hear the term tribal communities, right? Yeah. But what makes some of them particularly vulnerable? What are the official criteria, the things that really set these groups apart?
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. PVTGs, they're a special subcategory. Within the broader tribal groups in India, these are recognized as having even greater vulnerabilities. This idea actually came about back in the early 70s. A commission, the DBAR Commission, first recommended identifying what they called primitive tribal groups. Now, that name, primitive, it was rightly changed in 2006. They renamed them particularly vulnerable tribal groups to get rid of that, well, frankly, derogatory label.
Okay, so the name changed. But beyond that, what are the specific signs, those you mentioned 5 core characteristics, that tell us a group is a PVTG? What are those defining features?
It really boils down to 5 critical factors. And together they paint a picture of communities living, right at the very edge of survival, often deeply, deeply tied to their forest homes. First, their livelihood is almost entirely forest-based. Their main way of making a living depends directly on what the forest provides. Second, they often have what's called a pre-agricultural way of life. That means basically living like people did before farming became common, using very simple tools for hunting, gathering, foraging. Third, it's a subsistence-based economy, really hand-to-mouth survival. There's no surplus. They can't find food or work for a day. They might genuinely go hungry that night. Fourth, they suffer from an extremely low literacy rate. We're talking single digits often, sometimes, as low as 1% to 4%.
Just 1%? Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, and this one is perhaps the most alarming, they show a stagnant or declining population. Their numbers are actually shrinking, sometimes rapidly. Some face, potential extinction within decades.
That's incredibly stark. Declining populations. Just how low are we talking for some of these groups? Can you give us a sense of the scale here?
Well, their total population across all of India is only about 2.75 million. And like I said, it's dropping fast.
To give you some perspective on how truly dire this is, think about the Andaman Islands. Several tribes there have populations in the double or even single digits. The Sentinelese, for instance, number around 39. The Jarawas, maybe 243. And the Great Andamanese, just 43 individuals left.
43.
Yeah. These figures are profoundly shocking. It really puts them, right on the verge of extinction.
Those numbers are just heartbreaking. What are the biggest challenges, then, that are pushing these groups to such a precarious edge? What's causing this? It's a combination of major issues, really. A primary one is the loss of their traditional livelihoods and their habitats. Their whole lives are interwoven with the forest, right? But things like government conservation efforts, which sound good but can displace people, industrial projects like mining, deforestation, even tourism, they frequently lead to them being pushed out. And when they lose their forest home, they often just don't have the skills needed to survive in, say, an urban area. It traps them in this vicious cycle of poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, generation after generation.
That makes sense. A total disruption.
Exactly. And another really significant issue is their exclusion from official recognition. Even when they're identified as a PVTG, many aren't actually on the official scheduled tribe list, the ST list. Sometimes it's just a clerical error, unbelievably, but it severely limits their access to really crucial government benefits and support schemes. Then there's the perception issue. Despite the name change, the idea of them being primitive often persists, doesn't it? So officials might approach them with this sort of top-down, maybe even coercive mindset, seeing them as obstacles to development rather than unique cultures needing support.
Like they need to be fixed rather than helped.
Precisely. And here's a really deeply problematic consequence of those declining populations we mentioned. Some states have actually put blanket bans on reproductive choices. Things like abortion or vasectomy for PVTGs. They're essentially treating them like, well, like endangered animals. Now, some states have modified this slightly, but it diverts focus from the real problems causing population decline, which are things like poor healthcare facilities, lack of education, low income. What's more, there's a severe absence of current data. We just don't have up-to-date figures on their literacy, their health, their actual population numbers. The government lacks baseline surveys. This means any interventions, any help offered can't be properly targeted or measured for effectiveness. It also feeds into those extremely low literacy rates. Why? Because teachers assigned to remote PVTG areas often see it as a punishment posting.
Oh, right. So they don't want to be there.
Exactly. It leads to high absenteeism, sometimes even proxy teachers, someone else being paid to show up instead. It's a huge problem.
Wow. It sounds like the challenges are immense and they all kind of feed into each other. So what efforts are being made by the government? And what have expert committees recommended to try and tackle these massive issues?
Well, the government does have some schemes. There's the scheme for development of PVTGs, which gives grants to states for things like housing, livelihood support, healthcare, cultural preservation. And more recently, in the 2023 budget, a PM PVTG development mission was announced. It's got a pretty substantial budget, 15,000 crores over 3 years, focusing on basic essentials.
Yeah.
Safe housing, clean drinking water, sanitation, education.
Okay, so there is dedicated funding now.
Yes, which is a positive step. And various expert committees have made some really key recommendations over the years. For instance, they've strongly urged for all PVTGs to be officially granted SP status, scheduled tribe status, to ensure access to rights. They've also suggested a single window approach, basically, a one-stop shop so communities can access all the benefits they're entitled to without navigating complex bureaucracy. They also advocate for a rights-based approach, which means respecting existing laws like the Forest Rights Act, and a habitat approach, focusing on securing their livelihoods where they live in their traditional environments. And crucially, they keep emphasizing the need for regular surveys, proper data collection, so aid can actually be effective and targeted. One committee also proposed something called Mission Jivan, teams of doctors and social scientists assigned to each PVTG. But interestingly, they also suggested training tribal individuals for these roles, knowing the issues with outside professionals seeing it as a punishment posting.
That makes a lot of sense. Train people from within the community.
Exactly. There's also talk of a mission of Haidan specifically focused on protecting vulnerable tribal girls from trafficking, which is a tragic reality in some areas.
These are definitely complex problems needing very comprehensive, thoughtful solutions. Can you share some real-world examples that really bring these struggles to life?
Absolutely. The Baiga tribe is a powerful and sadly quite typical example. Hundreds of their families were displaced from the Achanakma Tiger Reserve. The government's rehabilitation efforts largely failed. They often weren't given proper land deeds, which left them insecure, forced them into cities as landless laborers. This just created this cycle of generational poverty, illiteracy, and drastically reduced their life expectancy. It was devastating. Or consider the Padhayas in Jharkhand. They faced severe malnutrition, even starvation deaths. The state government started a doorstep grain delivery scheme, the Dakia Yojana, which sounded good, but it failed miserably because they made Aadhaar, the national ID card, mandatory. And in these remote areas with poor digital infrastructure, many Padhayas simply couldn't get or use Aadhaar, so they were excluded from the food aid meant for them.
Wow, so the technology meant to help actually became a barrier.
Precisely. Then there's the really controversial Great Nicobar Project. It's a huge defense and tourism development plan that directly threatens the Champagne tribe there. Critics argue it violates the Forest Rights Act, and tribal advisory councils weren't properly consulted. It poses a severe risk to the Champagne's very existence. But perhaps the most, unsettling and widely reported case involves the Jarawas in the Andaman Islands. There's a road, the Andaman Trunk Road, that cuts right through their reserve forest. Now, there are rules against filming them, interacting, giving them things, but tourists engage in what's been called human safaris. People illegally throw food at them, like parluji biscuits. This introduces outside germs, microorganisms the Jarawas have no immunity against. It leads to disease, population decline. Historically, contact with outsiders like the British brought epidemics like measles that wiped out huge numbers. This is a modern version of that threat. The Supreme Court even had to intervene after a shocking video emerged of police officers apparently making Jarawam dance in exchange for biscuits.
That's just appalling, treating people like exhibits in a zoo.
It really is. It's a stark reminder of their human rights being violated, being treated as objects, not as a unique, vulnerable human community.
It's deeply unsettling to hear how these historical policies and, well, ongoing interactions have impacted these communities so profoundly. Which brings us to the other group we mentioned,
Right.
the Denotified Tribes. And here's where the history gets, frankly, really disturbing. Many communities in India are called Denotified Tribes, or DNTs. But that name hides a very, very dark past, doesn't it? Can you explain that origin for us?
Yes, absolutely. Denotified tribes, or DNTs, are communities that were officially declared criminal under a British law called the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. This shocking law essentially stated that people born into these specific communities were, by definition, criminal by birth. It had nothing to do with individual actions, just their ancestry.
Criminal by birth, that's just chillin'.
It is. After India gained independence, this act was finally repealed in 1952. The communities were initially called ex-criminal tribes, which still carried the stigma. Later, a commission recommended renaming them Denotified Tribes, meaning they were no longer notified under that criminal act, trying to remove that derogatory label.
Okay, so denotified means removed from that criminal list.
Yeah.
But the idea itself, criminal by birth, what was the historical context? What led the British to create such a drastic, frankly horrifying, legal classification?
It was a mix of things happening at the time. First, you had the collapse of various empires in India before the British fully took over. This left many tribal groups who had specific roles, like the Banjaras, who transported goods for Mughal armies, or warrior groups like the Ramoshis, suddenly jobless and often forced into nomadic lifestyles. The British viewed these nomadic groups with deep suspicion. This reflected a fear they already had back in Europe of mobile populations like gypsies who didn't fit their ideal of settled, civilized life.
So nomadism itself was suspicious to them.
Very much so. Second, their understanding, or perhaps misunderstanding, of caste played a big role. They tended to equate caste directly with profession. They developed this idea that certain communities were professionally criminal, engaged in things like organized highway robbery, what they called thuggy. This fed into racial ideologies prevalent in England at the time, which suggested that traits, even criminality, could be biologically inherited. You know, a Brahmin's son is a Brahmin, so a criminal's son must be a criminal. It was applied quite crudely to Indian society. And finally, a major trigger was the 1857 First War of Independence, or the Mutiny, as the British called it. Afterwards, they were absolutely determined to restore law and order and prevent future uprisings. Creating the Criminal Tribes Act became a convenient tool. They used these existing prejudices and fears about nomadic and unruly groups to justify classifying entire communities as inherently criminal, making them easier to control and suppress.
So it was a tool for control, wrapped up in these pseudoscientific racial ideas. Once this act was in place, what did it actually mean for people's daily lives? How did it impact someone born into a so-called criminal tribe?
The Act's implementation was incredibly harsh, really draconian. It gave local authorities sweeping powers. Anyone from a community notified under the Act could be arrested, detained indefinitely, often without any recourse to courts. Their movement was severely restricted. They often needed passes just to travel outside their village, and many had to report daily to the local police station, like common criminals. Whole communities were sometimes forced into special settlement camps or detention centers, isolated and under constant 247 surveillance. Christian missionaries were even brought in sometimes to try and civilize them. As some scholars, like Nina Radhakrishna, argue, it was fundamentally a tool to suppress resistance and create this category of undesirable people who didn't fit neatly into the colonial administration or economic system.
Just unimaginable restrictions. So even after independence, after the act was repealed and the names changed, does this stigma, this label of criminality, still affect these denotified tribes today? Is that path still haunting them?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. The stigma of criminality remains deeply, deeply entrenched in many parts of society, and particularly in interactions with law enforcement. DNTs are often the very first people suspected when a crime occurs in their vicinity. They can face immense pressure from police to confess, sometimes without any concrete evidence. That old identity persists. Even if the legal term is gone, the public perception, the suspicion, it lingers. It makes them easy scapegoats, vulnerable to police and sometimes political pressure. You hear awful stories, like police just rounding up everyone from the DNT settlement nearby whenever there's a theft.
So the label sticks, even generations later.
It really does. And beyond the direct stigma, their traditional occupations have also been severely jeopardized, adding to their vulnerability. Many were historically hunters, gatherers, pastoralists, nomadic herders, but modern developments like deforestation, strict Wildlife protection laws, forest policies, and the privatization of common lands have destroyed their resource base and restricted their movement. Think about the Buckerwald tribes in Kashmir, for example. Their traditional grazing routes are increasingly blocked or privatized due to tourism development, leading to conflict and immense pressure. Others were traditional craftspeople, metalworkers, basket weavers. They struggle to compete with mass-produced industrial goods, and even entertainers. Think about snake charmers, people who perform with monkeys or bears. The Wildlife Protection Act, while important for conservation, essentially ended their livelihoods overnight. And things like anti-beggary laws are often used against DNT communities who might practice traditional street performances like acrobatics. They get arrested and detained, treated as vagrants rather than skilled performers.
It sounds like modernization has hit them particularly hard, cutting off almost all their traditional ways of life.
It really has from multiple angles. And adding to all this is a profound lack of data and documentation. A commission back in 2008, the Reinke Commission, found that something like 50% of DNT individuals lacked valid identity documents. This makes it almost impossible for them to access government benefits, schemes, even basic rights. An absolutely shocking statistic is that around 98% of DNTs are estimated to be landless. 98%. And we don't even have clear numbers on their total population. There are rough estimates, maybe over 100 million people, but no updated census data for over a decade. Many states don't even maintain proper lists of the DNT communities living there, especially given their nomadic history. This leads to massive exclusion from any kind of targeted support. These factors contribute to severe malnutrition. Surveys, even older ones, showed staggering rates, like 90% of DNT women and children in Maharashtra suffering from hunger and malnutrition. And sadly, there are significant gender issues too. Child marriage is highly prevalent in many DNT communities, leading to poor health outcomes for young girls and high maternal mortality risks. In some specific communities, tragically, there exists a practice of hereditary prostitution, where the birth of a girl child might even be celebrated primarily for future income potential. This leads to devastatingly high rates of STDs like HIV and puts women at extreme risk of exploitation, including sometimes by police.
That's incredibly difficult to hear. The problem sounds so systemic, so deeply rooted in history and current policy failures. What are the government and these expert committees proposing to try and fix this? Are there comprehensive solutions being discussed?
Well, the government does have a few targeted schemes. There's one called SEED Scheme for Economic Empowerment of DNTs. It aims to allocate about 200 crores over 5 years, focusing on 4 areas: education, housing, livelihood, and health insurance. There are also a couple of specific schemes providing hostel facilities or scholarships for DNT students who aren't covered by other SC/ST/OBC schemes.
Okay, so some targeted efforts, but maybe limited in scope compared to the scale of the problem.
That's often the critique, yes. The various expert committees, like the Reinke Commission in 2008, the IDIG Commission in 2018, have consistently pushed for much larger, more systemic reforms. A major recurring recommendation is the creation of a permanent commission for DNTs, ideally with constitutional status, similar to the commissions for SCs, STs, and OBCs. This would give them a dedicated, powerful body to advocate for their rights and oversee policies. They also strongly recommend extending protection under the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act to DNTs to shield them from the specific kinds of abuse and discrimination they face, especially from law enforcement and locals. And critically, echoing the needs for PVTGs, they stress the urgent need for a proper census and regular baseline surveys. We need state-wise lists, accurate data to understand who they are, where they are, and what they need so interventions can actually work. There's also a big push to actively remove the stigma associated with them. This involves sensitization training for police and government officials, plus public awareness campaigns to challenge those old prejudices. To cater to their often nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles, ideas like mobile schools and mobile dispensaries have been proposed. Though it's important to note the challenges there too. Often teachers in mobile schools face poor pay and conditions. And finally, there are strong calls for legal reform, revising those harsh anti-beggary laws to shift from criminalization towards rehabilitation, providing shelters and skills training, and importantly, repealing the Habitual Offenders Act of 1952. Critics argue this act essentially carried forward the spirit of the old Criminal Tribes Act, violating the right to equality. They argue DNTs should simply be tried under common criminal law like any other citizen without this added layer of stigmatization.
Right, treating them as citizens, not as a suspect category. It's clear that the specific issues faced by both PVTGs and DNTs are often a direct, painful result of historical interactions with the state, especially during the colonial period. This brings us nicely to our final segment. Let's zoom out a bit and try to understand that broader impact. How did British colonial rule fundamentally change tribal life in India? What was it like before? And how did their policies create such lasting impacts?
That's a great question to tie it all together. Before the British really consolidated power, the interaction between tribal communities and the major Indian states like the Mughals or various regional kingdoms was often described as tangential. It was generally limited, sometimes cordial. Tribal lands often acted as natural buffer zones between larger political entities, and rulers generally had little reason or ability to deeply interfere with their internal affairs or ecosystems. It wasn't a perfect idyll, of course, but the level of disruption was far less.
Okay, so relatively isolated, or at least interacting on different terms. But then the British arrived, and as you said, everything changed. What were their core strategies, their main policies towards tribal groups that had such a profound effect?
Broadly, we can talk about three major British policies that dramatically reshaped tribal life and society. The first was a policy of classification or labeling. Initially, the British weren't overly concerned with many tribal groups living in remote, hilly, or forested areas that didn't seem commercially valuable. However, many British administrators were highly educated and driven by what they termed scientific curiosity. They started acting as ethnographers. They studied tribal customs, collected artifacts, and in some disturbing cases, even collected human skulls, like J.H. Hutton's infamous collection of Naga skulls. Through this process, they created these official social categories: tribe, which they generally defined as representing a backward, primitive stage in cultural evolution, and, as we discussed, the criminal tribe for those they deemed beyond civilizing or inherently deviant. These labels weren't neutral scientific observations, they were deeply embedded with British prejudices and assumptions about social hierarchy and progress. And what's really striking is that their official documents from that era, like the Imperial Gazetteer, are sometimes still referenced by the Indian government today when classifying communities for administrative purposes, impacting whether a group gets classified as ST, OBC, or something else, which has huge implications for benefits.
So those colonial labels have had a really long, tangible afterlife.
An incredibly long one. The second major policy was one of subjugation or subordination. As time went on, the British perspective shifted. They began to see tribal areas not just as remote hinterlands, but as reservoirs of valuable resources: timber for railways, coal for industry, land for plantations, potential sources of tax revenue. So they started actively penetrating these regions. They imposed their own laws, their legal systems, their customs, introduced new forms of taxation, and crucially, they dismantled traditional systems of communal land ownership, often declaring tribal lands terra nullius, vacant land belonging to the state. Naturally, tribes resisted these intrusions, this loss of autonomy and resources. The British, viewing this resistance primarily as an impediment to revenue collection and a challenge to their authority, responded with overwhelming force. They used what historians describe as extraordinary force and brutal subjugation to crush tribal revolts. We talked about the Santhal Rebellion earlier. Estimates suggest over 30,000 Santhals were killed, fighting with traditional weapons against British guns. The Munda Rebellion is another famous example. This violent suppression led directly to what's called pauperization, extreme impoverishment, and significant population decline for many tribal groups.
So first labeling, then outright conquest and resource extraction. What was the third policy?
The third is often termed a policy of isolation or protection, though the motives were complex and often self-serving. This was most prominently practiced in the northeast of India. Initially, the British interest there wasn't primarily commercial resources, it was strategic. They wanted to maintain the Northeast as a buffer state against other European colonial powers active in Southeast Asia, and also to protect their lucrative tea plantations in Assam from raids by hill tribes like the Nagas. They even paid some tribes protection money. To achieve this isolation, they introduced the Inner Line Regulation in 1873. This prohibited outsiders, including other Indians, from entering, residing, or acquiring property in these designated areas without a special permit. This permit system still exists today in some states. Alongside this political isolation, the British also allowed and sometimes encouraged Christian missionaries into these areas. This led to widespread conversions among many tribal groups in the Northeast. While providing education and healthcare, it also fostered a sense of loyalty to the British administration, which was evident, for instance, when Naga warriors fought fiercely alongside the British against the Japanese and the Indian National Army during World War II. However, a major post-independence consequence of this policy of isolation was a sense of alienation among many northeastern tribes from the newly formed idea of Indianness, contributing significantly to the various secessionist movements that emerged in the region. A form of isolation was also applied in parts of central India, especially after major tribal revolts. Laws like the Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act were introduced to regulate the transfer of land from tribals to non-tribals. Ostensibly, this was to protect tribals from exploitation by moneylenders and landlords. However, critics argue it also conveniently shifted blame away from the colonial state's own role in creating the conditions for exploitation while still maintaining ultimate control. Later, under the Government of India Act 1935, certain tribal dominant areas were designated as excluded or partially excluded areas, placing them under direct rule of the governor or with special gubernatorial powers, further institutionalizing a form of administrative isolation. These areas became the basis for the 5th and 6th schedules of the Indian Constitution after independence.
It really sounds like every policy, whether it was classifying them, conquering them, or even protecting them through isolation, always ultimately served British strategic or economic interests, didn't it? How do scholars generally summarize the long-term impact of this whole colonial interaction on tribal communities?
That's a very accurate summary. Scholars who've studied this period extensively really emphasize how fundamentally transformative and often destructive this colonial encounter was for tribal societies. People like F.G. Bailey and Thurji Sinha highlighted several key shifts. First, colonial rule effectively ended the relative isolation of most tribal communities, forcibly integrating them into the larger colonial economy and political system, often on very unfavorable terms. Second, it imposed direct state authority over resources like forests and land, which were previously managed communally according to traditional laws. State control, private property concepts, and new taxation systems replaced these older ways. This led, thirdly, to the decline of traditional communal modes of production and the introduction of privatization, creating new forms of inequality within tribal societies themselves. And fourth, as we've seen, it resulted in numerous tribal uprisings, both large and small, met with brutal suppression.
So a complete overturning of their previous world.
A complete overturning. S.R. Sharma added another layer to this, pointing out a simultaneous process of peasantization, where hunter-gatherer or shifting cultivator tribes were pushed into settled agriculture, primarily so the British could tax them more easily, and depeasantization. Depeasantization happened when already settled tribal farmers were displaced from their lands, often due to debt or land alienation, and forced to become landless agricultural laborers, perhaps on plantations like the Assam tea estates. Sharma also noted the decline of traditional tribal barter markets, replaced by a monetized cash economy, and the commercialization of forests, which destroyed access to resources and led to a loss of traditional craftsmanship that depended on those resources. He even observed changes in religious values due to missionary activities and the introduction of Christianity, which sometimes led to the decline of traditional institutions like youth dormitories, and sadly, even new forms of caste-like discrimination emerging between tribal converts and non-converts.
Wow. And was there a consensus on who benefited from this and who were the main exploiters?
Yes, scholar Subhadra Mitrachana perhaps summarized it most powerfully. She highlighted the introduction and consolidation of new exploitative classes within the tribal areas under colonial rule. The landlords, zamindars, often outsiders granted land rights by the British, the contractors, who exploited forest resources and tribal labor, and the ubiquitous moneylenders, sukar, who trapped tribals in cycles of debt. Under this new system, tribes were often reduced to being tenants on land that was once communally theirs. They were forced to pay rent in cash, which they often didn't have, forcing them to borrow from moneylenders at exorbitant rates, leading inevitably to debt bondage, where they or their families had to work essentially as slaves to repay loans. Chana famously described this combination, the zamindar, sarkar, the colonial government, and sukar, as the trinity of evils that systematically exploited tribal communities. And here's the absolutely critical point she made. These forces, this trinity, tragically outlasted colonial rule. They continued their exploitative practices long after the British left in 1947, meaning independence didn't automatically bring relief or justice for many tribal communities. Their misery, in many ways, continued under new masters.
That's a really powerful and tragic summary. The trinity of evils outlasting colonial rule. That really sticks with you. This deeper understanding of these communities, the PVTGs, the DNTs, their specific histories, and these broader colonial impacts driving their ongoing struggles, it's truly vital context. Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, let's do a quick recap. Just hit the main points again for active recall. Help solidify these important insights for everyone listening.
Good idea. So, For PVTGs, the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, remember those 5 defining criteria: their life totally dependent on the forest, often pre-agricultural ways, hand-to-mouth subsistence economy, extremely low literacy, and critically, those alarmingly stagnant or declining populations. Understand the major threats they face: the loss of their homes and livelihoods due to displacement, the problem of not being officially included on the ST list, which denies them benefits, persistent negative perceptions, health issues worsened by outside contact and lack of immunity, like we saw with the Jarawas, and the lack of good data hindering effective help.
Right. PVTGs, extreme vulnerability, declining numbers, threatened existence.
Exactly. Then, for the Denotified Tribes, DNTs, recall that painful unjust origin communities branded criminal by birth under that British Act. Remember that even though the law itself is gone, that deep stigma persists today. This stigma makes them vulnerable to police harassment and social discrimination. And remember how modernization and various laws have jeopardized almost all their traditional ways of making a living, from herding and crafts to performing arts, leaving many landless, undocumented, and trapped in poverty and poor health, with specific gender vulnerabilities being a major concern.
DNTs, the inherited stigma, lost livelihoods, and systemic exclusion.
Perfect. And finally, zooming out to the colonial impact. Reflect on how those 3 broad British policies, classification and labeling, creating categories like tribe and criminal tribe, subjugation and subordination, violent conquest, resource extraction, imposing laws, and even their strategy of isolation or protection, especially in the Northeast, creating buffer zones but also alienation, fundamentally and permanently transformed tribal societies. These policies ended their relative isolation, destroyed communal land ownership, introduced new forms of exploitation through that trinity of evils, the Zamindar, Sarkar, and Saukar, and critically, these exploitative systems didn't disappear with independence, they continued, embedding historical injustice into the present. So the big picture for both PVTGs and DNTs is that their current problems often stem from these deep systemic issues: a lack of proper data and recognition, failures in policy design and implementation, and the enduring heavy weight of historical injustice and inherited stigma.
That's a great summary. So, thinking about all this, what does it really mean for us, for you listening right now? It means understanding that communities like the PVTGs and the Denotified Tribes, they aren't just statistics you read about or some kind of historical footnote. They represent living histories. Each individual story is often one of incredible resilience in the face of challenges most of us can barely imagine. Their struggles reflect these really deep-seated issues in society, issues of inequality, historical wrongs, access to justice, basic human dignity that often get overlooked in the broader national conversation.
Yeah, and it really raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? In a world, in a country that's striving for equality, for development for all, how do we genuinely bridge the gap for communities whose past has so profoundly and often violently shaped their present? How do we ensure their dignity, which has so often been denied or ignored or worse, sometimes treated as a spectacle, is finally acknowledged and respected?
Exactly. So maybe next time you hear about tribal communities in the news, or perhaps even just notice someone living a life that seems very different, unconventional, take a moment. Ask yourself, what might be the deeper story here? Maybe it's a story, like we said, of incredible resilience. Or maybe it's a story shaped by the long shadow of policies and prejudices from decades, even centuries ago, that continue to impact lives right now. We really hope this deep dive encourages you to think more critically, maybe explore further. So reflecting on everything we've covered, what stands out most to you from today's deep dive? What aspect of this complex reality